I'm going to show you how I make one of these spinning tops. I like to call these no sand tops because my goal is to create the whole top and not use sandpaper. So it's good practice in using your tools and getting a really clean finish, particularly with the skew chisel. So you can see a couple of different designs here. And another nice thing about this project is that you can use really small pieces of wood and little offcuts and scraps. So I have pieces that, this is something left over from a batch of rolling pins that I did. And I have that also in, walnut, slightly larger, get 2 or 3 out of this. You can even take something like a piece of firewood, or this is an offcut from when I was processing some bowl blanks. Take something like this, you would put it in between centers, turn it so that you have it cylindrical with a tenon on the bottom, which can go into the chuck, and then you can proceed to the second part, which is actually turning the top. When you're doing this, it's important also that you have relatively straight grain. If you don't have straight grain, it doesn't necessarily keep you from making an effective top, but it makes it harder to do so without sanding. Something like this piece of walnut, where the grain kind of is all squiggly, it looks like it's even a little bit curly in here. This is going to be less predictable, and it's going to be hard, particularly when you're doing the stem of the top, because on one side you're going to be descending through the grain, and through the other side you're going to be ascending. So that's going to mean you're going to basically have tear out unless you use sandpaper. This piece of walnut looks quite a bit better, nice and straight grain, but anything with straight grain, walnut, cherry, any nice hardwood should work pretty well for this project. What I'm going to use for the project is a little bit of reclaim material. This is a little bit of mahogany from a bench a friend had that had been damaged. So if I'm working with something square like this and I'm using my chuck, a lot of people kind of intuitively put a square piece in like so, clamping on the corners. It's going to be a lot more secure if you actually rotate it like this. That's going to give you better contact on all 4 surfaces here. You can see the points are actually sticking out through, like so. Get both sides here of the chuck with the key, and really kind of reef down on that, get that locked in there. All right, so I could probably do this whole project without using my tailstock. I like to use it. First I need to bring my tool rest in on my banjo. I get this really nice and close. Always, of course, you want to give it a test spin, make sure you're not going to hit anything. And then, of course, bring in that tailstock just for a little added security. When I'm making these, I'm not spending a lot of time on them. And as such, I want to just be, safe and secure in here. Okay, so that's locked in. The first step now is going to be to create basically a cylinder before we start creating the shape of the top. So to do that, we're going to just use our roughing gouge. Mine's quite large here, but that should be no problem. So, the ABCs of wood turning, of course, are anchor, bringing your bevel in to the point where it starts to cut that edge. It's going to be just a little bit bumpy at first because we do have a square piece rather than a cylinder, but you can always start a little more vertically and kind of drop it into position as you go. Okay, anchor, bevel, contact right there. Okay, so we're ready to start roughing. I'm going to turn it on. So I'm just working from the high point on down. You can see I don't have it going straight in like so. I actually have it rotated to the side a little bit. And of course the advantage of that is that I can get nice and close like so. But usually what I'll do at this point is I'll grab my parting tool. The one I use a lot is this kind of wider beading parting tool. And I just bring that in just to create kind of a little bit of a shoulder. To keep me from going too close to the chuck there. Okay, so I finished roughing this out. Okay, put the tool on the top there. If it's bouncing, you'll feel it, and that'll indicate you're probably not round. I didn't feel any bouncing. Looks like, yeah, we got it. We've got a nice cylinder there. So the next step is going to be to actually create the point. You can imagine the top is going to be oriented in the piece of wood like this. Okay, so we're working on the point. And it's essential that we do the point before we do the smaller stem. If you reduce down in this stem area and then try to do the point here, it's going to cause the piece to flex and you're going to break the top. You're certainly not going to get a good cut on this surface here. So while I have a lot of material, I address this surface first. Okay, so I need to pull my tool rest, or rather my my tailstock out of the way. It's locked in there a little bit. Double check it's secure. I'm just going to give it a little crank just in case. Yeah, feels good. Okay, so for cutting this angle downward, I could maybe do a little bit of it with my roughing gouge, but the best thing really I think is our spindle gouge here with a little bit of a fingernail grind. To make this cut, I'm going to rotate to about 45 degrees so that the area directly under the point of the tool is pointing in the direction I want to be cutting. That way, this entire long surface is in contact as I'm moving through. That's going to give me a nice, clean, predictable cut. Okay, so I'm also not coming all the way back here, where the cut actually might start. I'm taking it off in little sections and working my way back to where I want to have that shoulder. Consider too, because I used my tailstock, I am going to have some damage out here. So the bottom of the top will not be right on this surface. I have a little bit of material to remove here, and I'll probably just do that with my spindle gouge. So that looks like this. Lock it down, rotate, working it slowly. So I still have a little bit of damage at the point there. You can see I kind of rounded it just a little bit. I think that looks nice. So at this point, most likely I'm going to have a little bit of tear out here on the end grain. Depending on the wood, you might be able to get a really perfect cut with your spindle gouge. But for me, I'm going to have better results just using one of my skew chisels. I have a couple kicking around back here. Oftentimes I'll use this kind of larger one for this step. So for this, I'm going to actually put it on point. like so. Same thing, the bevel needs to ride against the surface as I'm cutting. And I'm just going to cut right down through. Because this tear out probably goes in just a little bit, it doesn't look bad as I look at it. I do want to make 2 or 3 passes just to get a nice clean surface there. So that looks like this. Here too, I really can't take a ton of material. You can see even I started to get held up there. This really is delicate. Taking it nice and slow. It's really going to improve the results as well. So oftentimes on the side here, I like to create just a little flat plane, just like so. I got a pretty nice surface actually just from my roughing gouge. It really doesn't need a lot of improvement, but I usually come in and I use my skew chisel. This one's a little different. I prefer this for planing cuts, but and you'll note too, well, first you can see just the nice glossy finish I got from that. But you'll note I kind of swept it in a little bit. I usually go either in or out with this cut rather than making it perfectly parallel to the rotation. The reason being that kind of ensures that I'm cutting through the grain, descending through the grain, getting a really nice clean cut. If I go straight across, if there's some variation in the grain, I'm not going to get, a really clean cut. So oftentimes here I like to add just a little decorative detail. I make a little line. And then I use my wire tool. Not too much pressure here, let the friction do the work. Okay, looks good, beautiful. Okay, so it's important that I got all that shaping done on the outside before I start to come into this area and reduce this down to make that stem. To kind of start to hog out that material, I go back to this beading parting tool. This is really one of my favorites. And it can remove quite a bit of material rather quickly. It really is kind of a modified skew chisel parting tool. And I'm just going to, start cutting in here to create that stem. I don't want to also go too narrow once again before I create that taper. So I'm almost going to kind of tier it, create like a step down here so that I have still a bit of momentum or mass rather driving the top as it rotates. So again, anchor it, bevel comes into contact and you drop it down. Don't go too deep or it'll bind up on you. Okay, and I don't really want to go too much deeper than that because it's just going to stress me out, or stress out the wood rather, as I make this other cut on the top here. So again, I'm back to my spindle gouge. Here now I need to rotate in the opposite direction. That arrow that I'm describing, the point directly underneath the point, is facing the direction I'm trying to cut. Again, I don't start right here, which is where I actually in the end want to be. I'm going to start over here. Don't want to go too far there too, because I'm, likely to get a catch. But that looks pretty good, and all I really need to do is come across that surface and make a finishing cut using my skew chisel. So one thing I've kind of discovered from doing a lot of these is if I reduce this down a little bit further, as I'm using my skew chisel, I come through and I get just the tiniest little bit of vibration in the top, and it gives just kind of a wavy pattern in the wood, and it's kind of an interesting effect. So I'm going to reduce this down just a little bit, but it certainly means that I need to be delicate as I'm making cuts past this point, but I'm going to reduce down not all the way to what I'm going to end up with for my stem, but a little bit closer. Probably in there is safe. Okay, switch to my skew. Again, need to get that bevel in contact, so I rotate just a little bit so that the cut surface in a moment is going to be registering against my tool. So, and you can hear it. Ultimately, we need that stem to be pretty, narrow so that it doesn't throw the whole top out of kilter as it's spinning. I do want to remove just a little bit more material so that it's a little bit narrower this way. Okay, getting pretty small here. Okay, so at this point, all the work in, kind of the body of the top is done. I don't want to go back in there because I'm just going to break it right in that narrow point. This area that I've left that's kind of collared, this is going to be a little bit of a decorative bead almost. I use my skew to kind of reduce it down to a good size. I'm switching over now again to my parting tool just because it's a little bit narrower and I can maneuver it in here. And I'm really cutting on the point to create a nice glossy surface there. I think you can see the shine on that. Okay, so keeping mass in the upper area over here, reducing down in the rest of the stem. Going to put this on point. And I'm going a little bit deep there. Going to clean this up a little bit further. And I'm really cutting with the lead edge here and just rolling it into that point. So that looks pretty good. Again, you can see there's a little bit of a taper going down here. And that's, again, going to kind of ensure that I'm getting a nice planing cut and that the fibers are not getting pulled apart. So I have quite a bit of extra material here. I'm going to just hog some of it out of the way. It's going to make these successive cuts just a little bit easier. I don't want to have a really tall stem either. The problem with that is, once again, as it's rotating, it's going to cause it just to spin out. I'm going to basically part the piece off the lathe at this point. I'm going to add maybe a little decorative element here. And now I'm going to reduce this down using my skew. Okay, getting pretty narrow. Being careful here. Okay. So here we can see the finished piece. You can see a little bit of this kind of chatter in the top there that I was going for by reducing the stem a little bit first. You can see I got a really nice, clean, really kind of glossy finish here. So it looks pretty good. The test, of course, is to see if it'll spin. Looks pretty good. If I gave it a little bit more of a heave, it would really go. But it looks pretty good. I'm going to give it a little bit of oil and see how it works.